Hey, it's Rocky. Welcome to Richer Soul. Today's guest is Bill Treasurer, who talks about overcoming fear and finding courage at work, which of course leads to living the life of your dreams. Imagine it's 12 months from now, and you've achieved your major life goals. How does it feel to be in the best shape of your life? To wake up energized, excited about the day? To have great relationships and friends who support you and propel you forward? How does it feel to have an excess of money, to be able to make the choices you want? To be fearless and open to trying new adventures? Imagine being connected to the universe and it providing everything you desire. It's possible over time, and your past does not dictate your future. The only thing holding you back from this vision is you. It's time to take control of our thoughts and use them to our advantage. Welcome to Richer Soul, where we achieve our dreams and bring balance to health, wealth, relationships, time, and spirituality. If you have not had a chance to listen to episodes 1 through 9, I encourage you to go back and listen to the framework behind Richer Soul and how to create the life of your dreams. You can also find all the show notes for this episode at richersoul.com. While you're there, you can sign up for a monthly email where I share the best articles I read this month, let you know about upcoming episodes, and share a little wisdom. You can also listen to coaching calls under the Coaching Calls tab. I also share the most interesting articles I read every week on Facebook at facebook.com/Richer Soul. And there's also a Facebook group where you can ask questions and interact with other listeners. How are you doing with last week's action steps around increasing fiber in your diet? Have you done anything to improve or understand more about your microbiome? Our health is a major driver in other parts of life. Today, we'll focus more on mental health and overcoming fears and being courageous. I talked about fears in this month's email to my subscribers. If you're not already one, sign up. Today's story is about bananas, and this one came from the richest man in China. He said, if you put bananas and money in front of monkeys, monkeys will choose bananas because monkeys do not know that money can buy a lot of bananas. In reality, if you offer a job or a business to people, they would choose a job because most people do not know that businesses can bring in much more money than wages. Similarly, Robert Kiyosaki, author of the best-selling book Rich Dad, Poor Dad, said, one of the reasons the poor are poorer is because they are not trained to recognize entrepreneurship opportunities. They spend too much time in school, and what they have learned in school is to work for wages instead of money working for them. Profit is better than wages, for wages can make you a living, but profits can bring you a fortune. Think investments and stop fighting over increments of salary. It still won't be enough. Wow, that is some deep thinking on the way we think, and it turns some conventional wisdom upside down. Speaking of bananas and turning things upside down, how do you eat a banana? Do you peel it from the stem on the top? Did you know that that's actually the bottom? Because bananas grow up. The stem is the hardest part of the banana. Monkeys eat banana from what we consider the bottom. They hold the banana by the stem and pinch the other end, which is actually quite soft and easily splits. I have to admit, I think I've been doing this backward my whole life. I've been eating my bananas upside down. I think fear and courage are also done backwards, and maybe it's time we turn the tables around. Today's guest is an expert in building courage, and I'm excited for the conversation. Bill Treasurer is a workplace expert, courage pioneer, and author of Courage Goes to Work: How to Build Backbones, Boost Performance, and Get Results. He is founder of the Giant Leap Consulting, a consulting and training company specializes in courage building. He advises organizations including NASA, eBay, Lenovo, Saks Fifth Avenue, Spanx, and the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and the Pittsburgh Pirates on teaching workers the kind of courage that strengthens business and careers. Let's meet our guest. Welcome to Rich Your Soul, Bill Treasurer. It's great to have you join us today.
Rocky, I'm really looking forward to our time together.
As am I. We always start at the beginning. What was it like when you were growing up, and how much did your family and school teach you about money?
My family and school, most people didn't teach me much about money. I just knew that our family sort of struggled a bit. My dad drove a Volkswagen for most of our life. I mean, a Beetle. And we had 4 kids. I grew up in Larchmont, New York. But the person who really taught me the most about money was the person who didn't have much, and that was my grandmother. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment. We called her Goo-Goo. She's like a Saint Goo-Goo to our family now. She's in heaven, but she was frugal out of necessity. She grew up in the Great Depression, and she would give me these $50 that were from like 1930, 1920. I still have them. And she taught me the value of money and holding on to things that could be more valuable later. And I used to hold those $50 in my hand until my hand would turn green from the copper. And like I say, I still have some of them are silver dollars. I still have them. I didn't learn it in school. I had to learn it from the person who had it the least.
And that's quite interesting. I think we are losing the stories of the Depression era people. And I hear it with my guests who are probably the same age I am as you are, because their parents or their grandparents had that type of background. Today, we live in such abundance and excess, like the actual thought of those things just doesn't exist anymore. The stories of a bygone era.
I agree. All my grandparents are now dead, but I knew them all, except for one grandfather who died in a car accident when my mom was very young. But the rest of them I knew, and they were all Depression era people. And it wasn't that they were cheap. It was just that they were resourceful. They would use things and then they would patch them up again. I remember shoe goo, for example. If you had sneakers that got a hole in it, you didn't just go out and buy another $150 pair of Nikes. You put shoe goo on it to keep the flap of the rubber together. And they had no shame in doing that. I think that you're right. And today I wish that I could say I retained that same sense of resourcefulness. I've got 3 teenagers in the house, and man, they just want whatever the new device is on any given day. And it takes a lot of discipline to say no in today's times.
Takes courage, and we'll talk about that soon.
Yeah, exactly.
So are you doing anything different than to teach your kids about money?
The way that I teach my kids about money is the value of earning it. For example, my boys are always wanting a new doodad that they see on Amazon. And they go, "Hey, Dad, can I get this thing?" I'm the keeper of the yes or no. And they can't get it unless they do something to earn it. So my boys are out there mowing the lawn and such. My daughter, she does chores. And so there's the allowance structure is important. I also use money as an incentive. And I don't know if this fits into the Dr. Seuss or the Dr. Spock book of parenting, but I will incent my kids if there's something I want them to do. I will use money as an incentive because I want them to recognize that money is earned. Money is not something that you get and that you're entitled to. You don't get your allowance if you don't do anything to earn your allowance. I am a meritocratist. At the end of the day, I believe in merit. And as a sole business owner, I've had my business now for 18 years. There's a very tight connection between the effort I put in and the money I get as a result of my effort. It's not some distant thing. I'm not working for some big corporate machine where the finance department cooks up the check. I get the check if I do the work, and I want my kids to value that.
And that's an important lesson, and it's good that you're teaching that. And that's true. When you run your own business, you are responsible for your profit, and you need to understand the numbers and tie your actions directly to the results that you want.
And it's incessant. As a business owner and an entrepreneur, I learned early on that you're only as good as your last project, and that you have to keep the pipeline full with work forever. You don't just do a big project and then take a few months off. You keep the pipeline full, and you're incessantly looking for the next opportunity. I don't freak out about it. I mean, the business is 18 years old. It's always been there. But I'm very conscientious about honoring the work so that I deserve the money at the end of the day. When I cash a check, I want to be able to look at that check and think, you know what? I earned this. This was not given to me. And I want my kids to have that respect, that same value.
Impressive. Today, we're going to talk about courage. What inspired you to dig in and learn about this topic?
Yeah, Rocky, I've been working in the area of courage. I've been a courage builder for, well, as long as I've had the business. And it really rewinds to before this. I've had my business, as I say, for almost 20 years. Before this, I worked for a very large management consulting company called Accenture. Before that, I worked for a couple of small boutique consulting companies. I was also in graduate school before that. But before all of that, I had a very interesting job. My story and how I got involved with the idea of courage is that in high school, I was a springboard diver, and I did really well on the low board. I won the Westchester, New York County Diving Championships 3 times. Colleges started to dangle scholarships in front of me. And eventually all the colleges would ask the same question. They'd say, hey, you're a great low board diver. We're very interested in what you're doing. We've got some scholarship money, but we also have high board here. Tell us about your high board list of dives. And I never bothered to learn a high board list of dives because, one, my high school didn't compete on high board. And secondly, I was petrified and remain petrified of heights. So I had a coach who held me accountable to my potential. And what he did, Rocky, was he would take me down to Iona College where there was a diving board built on a hydraulic lift. So now he could take it from 1 meter and go up to 1.5 meter. And he put me outside of my comfort zone. And my heart was racing and I was upset and I didn't want to do the dives. And I was going over and doing screaming belly whompers. But after 200, 300 dives, I got better at 1.5 meter and I got comfortable. And then I'd start getting bored. What do you think he would do when I got bored?
Raise the board.
He would raise the board. And through this incremental process of modulating between comfort and discomfort, eventually, through months of work, I grew accustomed to moving out into discomfort and getting comfortable with that discomfort. And eventually I got a high board list of dives and went to West Virginia University on a full athletic scholarship. And then it didn't stop there. After graduating from West Virginia, I used that same incremental process to become a professional high diver, where I was diving from heights that scaled to over 100 feet, traveling at speeds in excess of 50 miles an hour, diving into a pool that was 10 feet deep, all the while petrified of heights. But I learned the value of preparation and focus and incrementalism. And eventually I thought this could be of value to people, is to learn how to do things that you're capable of doing, but fear is your biggest blockage.
It's a conversation I've been having with myself this past month is on fear. I mean, there are the fears like you talked about, fear of water, fear of heights. Those are big fears, and I think we're mindful from them. But what I've been noticing are the small fears, not making the phone call, not having a specific conversation with your wife, not trying something new. It's those little fears that I think we don't even notice. We ignore them because they're so trivial. And yet, when you look at them, they truly hold you back from massive success. It's the little teeny things. And just as you learned to dive, you were going up 18 inches at a time. Such a small distance, little baby steps. It's been enlightening to me to start noticing how much fear is just prevalent in little things throughout life. And they aren't that hard to overcome. They're no-risk situations.
Yeah, and that's a very careful insight, right? The idea that it's the small fears that, and the challenge is that if we consistently surrender to the small fears, then in the bigger moments where more courage is required, we're now not really prepared because we've capitulated to fear so many times. And yet it's super common, right? Like I do a lot of executive coaching, and I cannot tell you how many times, I mean, literally thousands of hours over the course of, 20 years. It's certainly, at least 2,000 hours worth of executive coaching sessions, one-on-one, 1-hour sessions. And I cannot tell you how many times that the crux of the issue is somebody avoiding a conversation that they need to have because it's uncomfortable. It's a boss who's upsetting them. It's a direct report who's upsetting them. It's not wanting to be uppity and ask for the raise. It almost always comes down to a conversation that the coachee is avoiding. And so much about the coach-coachee relationship is to help me help them take whatever high dive they need to be taking. So that becomes a metaphor, that the high dive, that each person is called professionally and personally to take sometimes little high dives and sometimes bigger ones. But it requires and how it requires courage is that it requires acknowledging the fact that you in fact are afraid, but doing the thing you're afraid to do. That's the differentiating between courage and cowardice. Will I engage with this fear, or will I let fear sort of win and I'll walk away from it?
And I think that's a big part of it, is taking action, which is something that I've noticed people don't do. The other thing, though, is when you have these fears, those stories just tend to replay in your head constantly. So not only are you not moving forward on the one thing that's holding you back, but that story is just taking up so much mind space and constantly kind of running in the background and sucking up all your time and preventing you from a lot of other things probably as well.
Yeah, there's an old saying that I love, and it certainly has proved true in my own life. If you don't learn the lesson, you have to repeat the class, meaning your life is going to keep confronting you with this thing you're avoiding because you're avoiding it. It's almost like a beach ball, right? Like you go to the beach, you've got a beach ball, and then you shove that beach ball under the water. I'm telling you, that beach ball is going to pop up. That if you let go of that beach ball, it's going to pop up somewhere else. And you can take these fearful things that you're afraid of and try to avoid them by ignoring them and pushing them under the water. But it's going to manifest itself somewhere in your life if you don't deal with it. So, if you don't learn the lesson, you have to repeat the class. Now, I don't want to suggest in any way, shape, or form, Rocky, that I'm not guilty of this myself. I think it's a very common human thing to do, but it has consequences.
Where do we learn fear from? Because if you look at little kids, they're not fearful, right? We put the fear into them. Maybe that's where we learn it from our parents. Do you have insights into that?
Well, it is interesting. There are some fears that apparently, from my reading and research, suggest that there are some fears that apparently are universal. Like we dream about snakes before we even know what a snake is. Fear of heights is almost innate in some people, right, to come with it. So there is a nature element to fear. Plus, you're born with an amygdala, which is a little piece in your brain, amygdala is the Latin word for almond, and it's because it looks like an almond. It's about the size of it, and it's always on high alert in your brain. And it's necessary. It protects you from harm and danger. It's why in the middle of the night, if you hear a noise downstairs in your basement, even if it's faint, you'll wake up with adrenaline coursing in your brain, in your body, because of your little amygdala. So fear has its place. There is a biology aspect to fear. There is no doubt about that. That said, I agree that so much of the fear is what we're learned when we're kids. Just think about all the don'ts we learn, right? Don't play with matches. Don't talk to strangers. Don't cross the road without looking both ways. So we teach our kids the don'ts. But at the end of the day, kids need to learn how to work with matches. They need to learn how to engage with other human beings that are strangers, and they need to learn how to get across the road. But instead of teaching them the do's, we teach them the don'ts.
And that's a shame. It's funny because it's the same thing with these money scripts. All of these things occur in childhood. And it's been the most enlightening thing to me is to just look at how much of our adulthood is driven by things that occurred to us when we were kids, and just going back and cleaning that all out and fixing it as an adult is literally what sets you free.
I think that, like, first of all, I am a parent, right? Like I mentioned, I've got teenagers. And I think that the challenge is that we like to use fear a lot to get our kids to stop stuff because it's effective. It's cheap because it works, right? We in fear our kids. I'll give you a specific example. My little son, when he was about 4, and he'll be 13 in September. But when he was about 4, there was a specific mask that we had. It was a vampire mask that we got for Halloween. And whenever I would put it on, he would be petrified. He would run outside of the room, and his 2 older siblings would laugh at him. And so we would use the mask to get him to stop something. So if he would, if he was doing something naughty, my wife and I would both be, we're going to get the mask, and then he would stop doing the naughty thing. So we would actually use fear to make him stop doing something. That's not a good strategy, because if that's all you've got as a parent is to use fear, you might as well just cut a check for like $15,000 for the therapy bills they're going to have to use later in life to overcome the fears that you've been put inside of them. So I agree that parents sometimes, that we learn, as parents, we use fear because it works. And if we were just a little bit more artful and a little bit more thoughtful, we would use a different approach. Now, in my counterbalancing that story, my other son, I knew he was a good swimmer, and he was swimming since he was like 18 months old. And I took a kayak to the beach one time, and I put him on the front of the kayak with me, and he was safe, and we were paddling out. And I said, "Hey son, why don't you go in the water now? Because now it's over your head." And he said, "But Dad, and he was like at 5 years old. He said, "But Dad, it's over my head." I said, "Yeah, but son, but you swim all the time." He's like, "No, Dad, I don't want to." And I said, "Okay, that's fair." I said, "Why don't you do this? Just dangle your feet in the water." So he did. He dangled his feet in the water. I said, "That was easy, right?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Why don't you now just put your body down to your waist in the water? I'm right here. I've got us safe." It's like, "But Dad, it's over my head." I said, "Just do it down to your waist." And so he did it down to his waist. And then he came back up, and I said, "I want to have a conversation with you about courage." And then I started talking about how, courage is doing the thing you're afraid to do. Even though you're fearful, you still do it. You do it to the degree that you're safe. I'm here keeping you safe. We had a conversation about courage. Then he put himself down to his shoulders in the water, still holding on to the kayak. And before long, I convinced him to, take his hands off the boat. And he was swimming under the kayak and around the kayak because he was perfectly capable of doing it. I just had to sort of lead him there as a parent so that he would gain confidence, psychological confidence, and psychological safety. So we as parents can teach courage just as often as we use in fear them. We should be encouraging them.
Absolutely. And I think that was one of the things when my kids were little, I knew I had fears. And what I did intentionally was make sure that they never had the fears I had. I would put them in situations that I was fearful of so that they would never develop those fears. And they don't have them. My kids have no fears of heights and water and all those types of things that I did because they just grew up not even thinking about it because I made sure that they were in situations where they just learned that it was no big deal.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome that you did that. I work with a woman who, when she was a kid, she had a bad experience in the water. And to this day, she wears a shower cap in the shower because of that fear. Can you believe it? I mean, she's like 70 years old and still carries that fear around.
It is unbelievable.
It's unbelievable. I credit you for doing that. I need to do it more, right? Even though I wrote a book on courage and I dedicate my life to it, I need to do more of that, of making sure that my kids don't have the fears that, and hangups that I've had as a human being.
Absolutely.
Mentioned I've got 3 kids, twin 15-year-olds who will be 16 in September, and then a 12-year-old who will be 13 in September. My one daughter has cerebral palsy, and she's deaf, so she's a person with special needs. Now, she has a cochlear implant, so she can hear, and we talk, and I went to the movies with her last night, and she can walk. She learned how to walk when she was 5. But she has lifelong physical challenges. There's no doubt about that. We went to an amusement park with my 3 kids, and my daughter was on those roller coasters more than my boys. And she always has been brave, right? Like partly out of necessity, maybe. She's had to confront the physical challenges of the world, but she's not stepped down from those challenges. And I remember one day I asked her, "Why do you love the roller coaster so much? Why do you like to do things that are scary like that?" And she talks different than you and I because she has cerebral palsy. She said, "I like to get brave." She said, "I like to get brave." She didn't say, "I like to be brave." She said, "I like to get brave." You have to go out and get the bravery. You have to act it. You have to get it. You are not it. You have to do something to deserve it. And in her case, it's getting on that roller coaster. She likes to get brave.
And we actually live next to an amusement park, literally. My kids grew up at riding roller coasters. Another thing I don't do. But I put the kids on the roller coaster. I'm like, you guys go. I'll go on the little ones. Part of it for me, it's the heights and it's the speed, but I also get horribly dizzy. I'm like, I'm not riding these because the rest of my day I'll have a headache. But you all go have fun. And literally over time, they start with the little ones and they built up to the big ones.
Yeah.
And they look at me like I'm nuts. I'm like, yeah, it's okay. You go. So you wrote the book, Courage Goes to Work, How to Build Backbones, Boost Performance, and Get Results. Why did you write the book?
I wrote the book because I wanted to codify my belief system around risk-taking and courage. Partly I wanted to translate that experience I had as a high diver and bring value into the workplace with those concepts. And because I realized that, in the book I mentioned that Aristotle said that courage is the first virtue because it makes all the other virtues possible. So I started thinking about that, and then I would see that same quote. I've seen Maya Angelou had a very similar quote. Winston Churchill called it the first of the human qualities. C.S. Lewis, the great theologian, said that it is not just one of the virtues, it's all of the virtues taken to the testing point. So outside of work, courage has always been the premier life virtue. And I started thinking, I'm like, well, why would it be any different in the workplace? And then I started thinking, the workplace is really the great bastion of fear. A lot of bosses and leaders use fear to motivate people. That makes it a place that is ripe for the application of courage. And then I started thinking about, leaders require courage because they have to bring change to people, and change will be resisted by a lot of people when a leader renders a decision. And that takes courage to face down that turbulence. It takes courage to be a business innovator and draw outside the lines and make some forward-falling mistakes. And the greatest innovations almost always start out as blasphemy to what existed before. So that takes courage. Or to be a business developer or a great salesperson means to knock on hundreds of doors in the face of rejection over and over again. That takes courage. So I started thinking about all the things that connect to courage in the workplace. And I think I ought to write a book about this because we need courage not just in our outside lives as a virtue. We need it to be the premier virtue in the workplace if we want to have a successful career. That was really the starting point.
Because that brings up an issue. I think people always worry about, if I do something, will I lose my job? So there's that whole fear there. I know companies want people to make courageous decisions, but they don't reward it in most places. And I think a lot of times it's the opposite. If you go outside the lines, everyone starts pulling you back in. How do you deal with that in the workplace? What do you do to step up and say, you know what? I'm going to go this way. I'm going to do this.
You're right. It's something that so many leaders and organizations, there'll be a big town hall meeting and the senior most leader will get up there and sort of cough in the mic and clear his voice and say, we expect our people to be courageous and we support you in doing that. And then the first sign of courage, they thwart it down. It happens, a lot. The first thing we do is, first of all, we break courage into three different behavioral buckets that we call the 3 buckets of courage. So that's true that courage does get shot down with one dimension of courage in particular, and it's what we call tell courage. It's the courage of voice or assertiveness, the courage of the truth teller. And there can be consequences if you tell the truth in an impolitical way or that truth offends the ears that are going to hear it. Sometimes there can be repercussions, which is why, in fact, it takes courage to be a truth teller in the workplace. But that's one dimension of courage, and we can rewind back to that. But the second dimension of courage is the courage of vulnerability and emotional exposure, getting disarmed, and we would call that trust courage. It's a whole different area of courage. Are you willing to empower other people to get the job done without micromanaging them and over-controlling the situation, for example? That takes a certain degree of empowering others in trusting them. Now, there's the reason that takes courage is because you could get betrayed. You could entrust somebody who could use that trust against you, or you could entrust somebody who isn't really worthy and deserving of the trust, and they drop the ball, and it becomes a reflection on you. So it takes courage. Then the third bucket of courage is what we call try courage. It's the courage of first attempts. It's the courage to do something you've not done before and stretch into new skills. We grow, progress, and evolve in a zone of discomfort, not comfort. And so try courage is the willingness to engage with discomfort so that I gain new skills. So the first thing we do is we share with people the three different behavioral buckets of courage so that they can recognize that not all courage is the same. It expresses itself in different ways. That said, to your point, Rocky, so that if an organization shuts down courage and they say they want courage, which let's call it what it is, hypocritical, and it lacks integrity. But we try to work with senior executives first. Our preference is always to come in at the top levels to have conversations with individual, from the C-level on down, and I mean C-level at CEO, CFO, COO, et cetera, and talk individually about what role has courage played in their own career. What are times that they regret that fear got in the way? What are strategies that the company is now putting in place and goals and priorities that the company has that warrant the full usage of everyone's courage, and in what ways? And we also have conversations around what are inappropriate displays of courage that they don't want to see in the workplace. So we get clarity at the top, and then we share our notions of how courage can be. And we also let them know the dangers of fear-based leadership, which is a whole other topic that we often explore. But I'll stop there because I realize I said a whole bunch in that.
It reminds me, because as you think about all the stories about a king, and they go off to war all the time, and the first guy who runs back and tells the king that things didn't go well usually gets killed.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's the bearer of bad news. And I think it's ingrained into us. All the stories are the guy who comes with the bad news is the one who's going to get the results of the bad story, even though they had nothing to do with anything but just bringing the news.
Yeah. In our program, so I've got a courage building program that we do a lot of design, development, and delivery of leadership development programs. Many of them are comprehensive in nature, and I mean 2-year programs. We just launched a 2-year program that's starting in Arizona. But in some of those, we do a 1-day workshop on courage itself. And one of the things that we introduce the participants to is 2 different behavioral dispositions when it comes to leadership. You're either putting courage inside of people, literally the word encouragement. You're putting courage inside of them by helping them stretch into discomfort so that they add more value and gain more skills. So you are an encourager, and we call that person a filler because they fill you with courage. Versus the other leadership disposition, which injects you with fear and anxiety. And they may do it because they want you to be conscientious and they want you to be just as worried about the business as they are. So they inject you with fear and anxiety, displacing your courage in the process, literally discouraging you. We call that leader a spiller. And so we draw differentiation between a filler and a spiller. And we have acknowledgement in the room. We get stories from people about when they have been spilling with their employees, when they should have opted for filling. And we spend a lot of time on fear-based leadership. So the kind of leader you're talking about, right, sends people off to war and then hears the bad news and then kills the messenger. We would call that a spiller. But we would also bring differentiation. There's a big difference between being a leader and being a ruler. And I think a lot of people still sort of resort to rulership kind of behavior as opposed to leadership behavior in the workplace. But when they're confronted with the facts and they're given an alternative set of leadership behaviors, because you have to remember, Rocky, a lot of people never got any leadership training, right? Like they default to their dad or their mom or what they've seen on TV instead of developing their own leadership style and preference.
It's true. We don't teach leadership. We teach followership, I think, more so. Mm. We will be back with Bill in a moment. I find it interesting that we want people to be leaders, but we don't teach them to be leaders over time. We wait till they are in power, which probably explains the Peter principle, which is for every employee to rise in the hierarchy through promotion until they reach a level of respective incompetence. Who wants to be incompetent? Not me, and I'm sure not you. That is why the power of having a coach to help you to the next level is important. I coach small business owners to focus on profit so they can fuel the time and the space to be great leaders. We work through fears around the P&L statement. And for a lot of you, that might feel like a root canal to look at, but I make it fun and comfortable. If you want help to focus on profit in your business so you can have the space to work on your business and life instead of being stuck on the hamster wheel, reach out and schedule a no-obligation call. Get over your fear and send the email. It's rocky@richersoul.com. What's the worst that happens? You learn something new? Now, let's get back to our amazing conversation with Bill Treasurer and how to create balance between rewarding success and failure. So this brings up the question of where do you find the balance between the filling and the spilling? Because if you encourage people to the point that they take too much risk, then the business folds.
Right.
How do you find that balance to reward people and encourage them to make mistakes and to essentially fail and then to learn from that, but also keep the balance of not blowing up the business?
Right. It's a good question. Well, first, let's acknowledge that as leaders, you have to get results, right? I mean, if your company's not profitable, you don't have a company. So profitability matters and results matter. The challenge is sometimes leaders fixate so much on results. It's like, I need another golden egg. You better produce another golden egg. Hey, we're down on our golden eggs. You better squeeze out another golden egg, not recognizing that you got to take care of that goose because that goose is going to be laying those golden eggs for you. So the result is an ends. And a lot of leaders fixate on the ends and freak out when they're not getting the ends that they want. But not enough leaders pay enough attention to the means to the ends, which is the treatment of people. You're right. There is a balance because there has to be consequences for dunderheaded or habitual mistake making. You don't want your people taking risks that are dumb for the business. There does have to be calculation. That said, as a leader, you have to reward appropriate mistake making if the mistake was done for logical reasons, if that leader, him or herself, would have made the same decision, if it is a mistake that you wouldn't have made, did the person learn some visceral lesson that they are going to carry for the rest of their careers, and was it worth it for the business? Did it fall forward and turn you on to some new innovation because of the mistake, in fact? So there has to be proportionality. There has to be reasonability. There has to be judiciousness on the part of the leader. But I would err on the side of wanting employees who demonstrate courage than those who don't. That's the bottom line for me. I'd rather have an employee who stepped up to challenges, who embraced changes, who had gusto and wanted to move forward, who was willing to go out of their comfort zone to acquire new skills, who, yes, might occasionally bite off more risk than they can chew. But I'd rather have that than somebody who's ensconced in safety, who plays it safe to the detriment of their own career and growth, who never aspires to a higher level or new responsibilities or capabilities, somebody who plays it safe to the point of being dangerous to themselves or the business.
So dealing with all the people that you've dealt with, where does the breakdown come? How many people are playing it safe versus what percentage are stepping up and being courageous?
I think that some of it has to do with the culture within which those employees work. There are some cultures that I've worked with that the preoccupation with safety, sometimes it's because it's a political thing. I've worked with some organizations, frankly, that are government agencies where their appetite for risk-taking is very low because they will lose budget approval, because they might be in a business, if you will, even though it's government, that is related to safety. On the other hand, I've also worked with NASA. And NASA had an appetite for risk taking. There's a reason why NASA has never had problem recruiting people. Of the government agencies, they've always had, there's like 280 government agencies, they've always had the highest morale when they do engagement surveys because they're facing big challenges and they take on risk and they are willing to do bold things. They do it in a smart, calculated way, but they take it on, right? So the breakdown is going to be, it depends on the culture. So I just gave you an example of government, right? Like we automatically, we assume government is lethargic and bureaucratic and such, and many times it is. But there are other parts of the government, like I mentioned, NASA, that are not like that. So I've worked with the gamut. I worked with a company called Spanx, and Spanx makes women's shapewear, founded by Sarah Blakely. And Sarah has a gusto attitude. She created $1 billion company and multinational, international retail enterprise. And she carries an ethos of courage. You'd shake her hand and you could almost break it. It's so light in your own hand. And yet she's got like a lioness heart of courage. And it sets a whole tone for the culture at Spanx and the willingness to do new things, like creating shapewear even for men. They create underwear, shirts that hide men's beer bellies. That was an innovation, right? They opened up retail outlets before they did that. They didn't have retail outlets. So a lot of times it's signified through the disposition of the founder of the company and the culture that they want to create. Versus, I've worked with plenty of other companies where the breakdown was, don't ever talk back to your bosses. Don't offer a new idea unless you're told to. You better not extend the game was hide out as long as you can and don't be found out and hunker down. I've seen those kind of cultures too. I'd never be successful in a place like that, but I see them.
And that's a shame that they are still out there. One of the things we talked about, the tell truth, and then how do you build trust? Vulnerability is not a word that comes up in the corporate environment very often.
This is true, especially, frankly, with men. You hear it a little bit more with women. Brené Brown has written her books dealing with vulnerability and shame, and it's become much more popular now. It's certainly now more in the it's now more popular in the lexicon, and so you hear it a little bit more now. Vulnerability. And the reason you hear it is because people recognize the value. So, for example, if you see a leader who fesses up to their own mistakes, it's authenticity. In the old days, we wanted the John Wayne leader who was invincible, who never confessed to a mistake, and it was always just sort of move forward. But now we prefer authenticity in the leader, and especially the newer generations coming up, right? They just don't. They have low tolerance for sort of fake leadership. And so they want a leader who is willing to display some degree of vulnerability because it suggests humility. We've seen leaders go so far out over their skin or over their skis with arrogance that they decimate their entire careers and reputations. And that's the overuse. We would call that hubris, right? That's too much confidence. The overuse, the overconfidence. Dangerous overconfidence is hubris. But we want a leader to be confident, but we want to make sure that that leader also has humility, and humility requires a degree of vulnerability. So how do you teach it, to your question? It's not an easy thing to teach. I think the first thing you have to teach is the value of vulnerability, why it matters, why a person would want to see a leader who's real with warts and all and imperfections. And then have people explore their own criteria with which they will trust people. So oftentimes we'll ask people in a workshop to fill in the blank to this statement. I will trust you when. And then we have them fill that in. I will trust you when. And it runs the gamut. Some people will say, I'll trust you when you prove to me that you can be trusted. They want the whole world to prove to them that they're trustworthy before they ever bless them with their trust. On the other hand, there are other people who are like, I'll trust you always. Even if you screw up, I'll probably trust you again. And I don't know that I'd want to be that person either. But we get them to think about what is the criteria with which they look for in another person where they would become willing to trust. But trust requires a degree of vulnerability, just as in any relationship does. It requires, you think about it, your own relationship with your spouse, for example. You can't be a fake. Your spouse won't tolerate it, for one. And so vulnerability is essential for human relationships. And we may not like the word, but it takes courage to get there because it feels so funky.
That it does. And it's taking the small steps and building up to practice. I will call it a muscle. You've got to literally build up the muscle and learn to be able to do that. And it's funny how many things we fear that never come to be.
Mm-hmm.
And it happens so often. And I think the reality is 99% of the things that we fear are going to go wrong never occur. Maybe that's why it works, because if I fear it, it'll never happen, right?
Yeah, right. Gives us sort of a catastrophizing mindset that we're always figuring out the worst case outcome. So, some degree that's okay, right? Like we do that in our workshops. We put together what we call the worst case grid. We have a person, contemplate what is some big, bold thing that they're facing in their career right now. And then as they contemplate that, we say, okay, what's the worst case scenario? If you take this bold move, how bad is bad? And then we have them identify the probability of that bad outcome occurring. And they create a little grid. And it's a numeric value, too, that they come up with. But it's interesting because almost everybody will, when they think about the worst case outcome, you're not going to die. Like if you start a business and it fails, you're not going to die. The worst case would be you'd be eaten at a soup kitchen for a little while, but that's not going to happen either in all likelihood. But we tend to catastrophize these outcomes like, oh, if I do that, I know I'm just going to die, or this person's going to leave me, or I think it just stretches our mind. And then when that doesn't happen as bad as that, we feel that we feel somehow relief, I guess. But you're right. A lot of people do. What we try to get people to do, Rocky, is to also flip that. Let's also now consider the best case outcome. Let's assume that you do this big thing that you're afraid of and it works out. What's the best case and what's the probability that will happen? And what are the actions we can take to increase that probability?
And I think that's an important word. And it's something that people don't focus on enough is probability. What are the chances of something happening? And I think when you start putting probability into an equation, it really helps to essentially, I'll call it do the math, because you realize that for a lot of these things, the probability is so low that it's not worth worrying about. Whereas, and it's also, like you said, the probability of success a lot of times is very high, and you need to measure both of them and actually think through it as well.
Right. Yeah. It's almost like doing a calculated pro and con. It's not enough to just say, what am I going to get or what am I going to lose? That's a very simplistic way. But also, what is the probability and how can I affect and influence the probability? And if the probability is high that there's going to be failure, are there any actions I can do to reduce that failure, such as speaking to somebody who's already done this hard thing, taking some classes and getting educated about the hard thing, getting a coach to help me through the hard thing. So you can, even when you identify the probabilities, then the contemplation becomes, how can I increase the odds and put them more in my favor? We oftentimes focus on the thing that we don't want, and then we'll use that even in our language. So when we're a leader, we'll be like, whatever you do, don't drop that ball. If you drop that ball, there's going to be big consequences. So don't drop the ball. Here's the ball. Don't drop the ball. Don't drop it now. Instead of saying, hey, here's the ball. We need to keep that ball up. That ball's got to be up 95% of the time. Here's some other things that other people have used to keep the ball up. Let's keep the ball up. Right? We're focusing on don't drop the ball instead of how to keep the ball up.
And when you do that, you literally drop the ball, because that's what everyone's focused on, dropping the ball. And so the outcome becomes to drop the ball.
Exactly. It's another example of being a spiller in our behavior. I'm guilty of it too. You get what you fixate on, I think. A lot of times it just happens.
And that is correct. And so if you fixate on success and accomplishment, you get it, because that's what you're fixated on. And so when you're clear on what you want, it occurs, and it's not magic. It's just, that's what you're fixated on, and that's what occurs. You also talked about try courage, which is taking action. And this is one that I've noticed very few people take action. How do you get people to do that?
Well, one of the things that you just said there in terms of fixating on what you want, that we actually call that the holy question. I had a priest one time say that the four most important words in the English language that you'll ever learn are, what do you want? What do you want? He called it the holy question. And I think that when a person with specificity can identify what it is, what is the condition that they want that they don't yet have, in other words, a superriding goal, an overarching goal, then the fear becomes sublimated by the goal. There's a playwright in Chicago named Ambrose Redmoon. He said that courage is not the absence of fear. It's having a goal that causes your fear to be sublimated by your courage, something to that effect. In other words, when you've got something more important than your fear, then the fear becomes diminished by that thing that's important. And so having goals, first of all, it helps with the amplification of try-courage, the willingness to step out on the skinny branches to get the thing that you want, because that thing you want is so important in your life. I also get people to think about the ancestors in their life from their own personal lineage, right? Like I came from Norwegian and Irish, right? And I know some of my great-grandparents who died and such, and my grandfather. And when I'm confronting a big, bold, try-courage action, sometimes I'll think about, what would my ancestors tell me to do? I'm stuck in this moment of fear. I'm contemplating doing something that I know I should do, but I've got a lot of fear of taking this action. How would the people that have died and gone off onto the other world, how would they advise me in this moment? And I know that in almost all cases of the person I'm contemplating, they're going to tell me to do the thing. They're not going to, now they're going to tell me to do it smartly, but they're not going to say, no, you really need to play it safe. Don't do it. Live small. Don't take another, don't have what you want, So there are things you can do to impel or, provoke a person to move towards taking the bold action. The other thing is we would call lead ups, right? Like no high diver will go and do one dive from 100 feet without doing 100 jumps from 1 foot first. There is an incrementalism. It's okay to do little leaps before you do a giant leap.
And I talk about jump with a parachute.
Mm-hmm.
Always have your risk mitigation plan in place and learn to do that so that if you make the wrong jump, you still have a safe landing, because we don't want to crash and burn.
Yeah. Goes back to the probability piece and such. When I left Accenture, I was making 6 figures, and this is back in, the early 2000s. But I went out and I started on my own, and this was it was the year after 9/11. And I just, knew that life is fragile, life is short, and I have this one life to live. And now the jig was up when I saw 9/11, and I said, I'm going to, leave. But I didn't just leave. I saved 6 months worth of income. I took night classes at Emory University about how to start a business. I talked to other small business owners in the consulting space. At some point in the decision process, I told my boss I was going to leave Accenture, and he tried to save me from doing that. But then he also made it easier for me once I told him that, he helped me sort of with the preparation and made it a softer landing. So, there are things that you can do to create that parachute, right? So it gives you a softer landing in the event that you did fail. But by doing all that preparation, you're actually increasing your likelihood of success anyway.
Very true. Why did you decide to make that change in life and walk away?
I saw 9/11, and I'm a New Yorker. I had a friend who died in the buildings that day. And it was just such a radical experience for me. I had a vague notion of starting my business before that event. But after that event, I just had a sense of, I liked working at Accenture, and I had some very great professional friendships, many of them that I maintain to this day. But I was putting all of my creative energy into this machine that, it wasn't, I felt like I was selling little bits of my soul every day. And at some point I just said, I'm going to put my soul in the service of, I want to bring courage to people. And if I'm going to do that, I have to do something courageous myself. And that is to start my business so I can amplify my voice in the world and and dedicate it to a courage building company, which in fact, courage building is one of my URLs. That's what I do now. And in fact, my first client, Rocky, I'm lucky, I was fortunate, but my first client was Accenture. And for the first 2 years of my business with Accenture floated my business. So it worked out sort of ideally, but it became, some people can go through life with a low level tolerance for misery. I am a big wimp that way. I can't. I have a low tolerance for pain and misery. And I had slowly started to become miserable because I was selling my soul every day to the corporate machine, and I didn't want to do it anymore.
And I get that. That's kind of the backbone here is richer soul is you've got to follow your soul, and you have to understand what it is that you want in life and be courageous enough to take the step to go out and do it. And I think for a lot of people, they are beaten down. And so they need that courage. And I think if you get someone to hold your hand as you go through the process, it can make it so much easier. And you find accountability people and, you find your safe glide path to make it happen. And that's exactly what you did.
Yeah, and I love that term, glide path. I hadn't heard that before. I like that. Henry David Thoreau said that most men lead lives of quiet desperation. Most of us have heard that quote. But the second part is, and go to the grave with the song still in them. And I wasn't willing to stifle my voice and go to the grave with the song still in me. Now, it helped that I have a supportive wife, right? Like if my spouse didn't support that big leap, it would have been an entirely different equation. And I also recognize that there is a time frame. There is a longer arc to the story. The first year was rough, right? I mean, I definitely took a huge cut in pay that first year, dramatically. But I stuck it out, and it wasn't long before I was eclipsing the salary that I was making at Accenture anyway. But I would tell your listeners that that you and I have been there, Rocky, and that they can get to the other side too. They don't have to go to the grave with the song still in them. Part of it is the application of their courage. And when they see naysayers, to not capitulate to naysayers, because it might in fact just be one of the major signs that they're on to something good. Because the naysayers will always come out when you're working on to something good that they don't agree with. But there will be some magical yay-sayers who will support you, and use those folks as advocates.
And that's true. Successful people want to surround themselves with other successful people, and they want to encourage people to go out and create success. And I think I don't remember the exact quote. It's more along the lines of don't fear death. Fear the person you are meeting the person you could have become. Right? And I don't remember exactly how that quote goes, but that's really essentially what you said, is going to your deathbed without becoming the person you could have been.
Yeah.
It's a massive regret.
It's a massive regret. In fact, we say in our courage building and risk taking programs, that the risks we regret the most in life are very often the ones that we didn't take. And there's something called the theory of least regrets. And when we use this in our courage building workshops, we tell people when they're thinking about a big risk that to put it through the theory of least regrets. And that is to ask themselves this question: what will you regret the least? Taking this big, bold move and maybe wiping out and failing, or not taking it and never knowing if you could have been successful. There are many bar stools in this country today being warmed by the seat of a person who's yelling at a TV, talking about how they could have been a contender, but weren't.
That is very, very true. If you're a leader, you can be courageous. If you own your company, you're free to make the choices and to go down this path. And if you're at an executive level or management level, you may not be able to change above it, but you can change below it. What does the employee do, though, that is in an environment that does not encourage courage? Do they try and change it, or do you walk away?
Well, first of all, the thought that a single individual would change a corporate culture, an organization that has over 100 people, is really low, right? Like the probability that that person's own dissatisfaction is going to change the culture is low. So then the person has to decide, am I what changes can I make to my job and my world here within the culture, and are they worth making? One thing that we would suggest, Rocky, is to sit down with your boss, and as you're going through, say, for example, your performance review, and at the end of the performance review, say, hey, boss, I just need to know something. Do you need me to sort of be a yes person, or do you occasionally, want me to have the courage to say something if I see something is out of pattern or it's not going to help your goals? How truthful am I allowed to be with you, boss? Now, most bosses, Rocky, will say, no, I don't want to be surrounded by yes people and sycophants. I need you to speak up to me. So then the person has to say, well, great, I will honor this commitment between you and me, boss. That said, I need your coaching. How can I disagree with you in a way that you won't see it as disrespect to your authority? And usually the boss will say something like, just don't do it in front of when we're having our staff meeting. Don't do it when I'm walking into the board meeting. That it's a tight time for me. Don't do it when you see I got 50 items on my to-do list. Here's how to do it. Give me the heads up that you want to talk about something, and then you and I will go to lunch and we'll talk. So they'll get the coaching. Right? So you have to make a new agreement with your boss, set a new ground rule with your boss, get confirmation with your boss that you now are expected to be a truth teller with your boss, that you are expected to do courageous things with your boss. As long as you set the ground rule and you make it in the service of your boss's goals, then they're going to have a lot more receptivity to your courageous actions. But if you don't change the ground rules and you're stuck in a culture that doesn't support it, and you can't have that kind of conversation with your boss, then I suggest you find a place where you can thrive because you're not in it.
And I think that was very wise advice. So thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Is there anything else on the subject of courage that we should have talked about but didn't get a chance to?
I don't think so. I would encourage your listeners to keep these two words in the forefront of your thinking, whether you're in a leadership role or a followership role or a place of influence. Whenever you're confronting something hard, challenging, and scary, just remember these two words as you move forward. Be courageous. Use it as a mantra. And sometimes it might be the courage to say no to something. Courage is not always a full-throttled yes, but courage often is a disciplined no. But use those words like a mental mantra. Be courageous when you're facing things that are hard. It'll help point you to doing the next right thing. Right things almost always require courageous action.
That is very, very true. Based on our conversation, what's one action step people can take to move forward this week?
I would have them do this. Write down a day in the life of them at work 6 months from now that would be really satisfying. So write down a few paragraphs. How do they start that day? What kind of meetings are they having? What kind of work are they involved with? How are they applying their courage in that day? What is a day in the life of the person 6 months from now? And then go farther. Identify 3 actions that you could take this week to get you to that life that you'd like to have at work 6 months from now. Be sure to include courage in that equation.
And I think that's an excellent action step. And I think when you actually sit down and think about what you want, which I find most people don't, and then you just start taking small steps towards it, it becomes reality. But you have to sit down first and say, what is it that I want? And then figure out the steps to get to it. And when you do, more than likely, you will achieve what you want.
Yeah, it's almost like strategic planning for your life. Your company has a strategic plan and a vision of where it's going. You need to have one for your own life too.
Absolutely. It's time to learn the secrets of life. What's your secret to living an abundant, courageous life?
My secret is to hold myself accountable to living the values that I bring to other people in my career, and that is to be courageous. I do my level best to apply my courage every day.
And I think one of the things that's involved in that is to know your values. And so I think people should take the time to figure out what it is for you that you value. And clearly, you know what it is in your life. What did you learn later in life that you wish you would have learned sooner?
That's a good question. I think later in life, I learned to trust my instincts, and that means trusting myself. And it took me a while to get there, and now I do. I trust my track record. I trust that I'll figure it out. I'll trust my gut a lot more than I did. It sounds almost cliche. I think it's something that you learn later in life, and I trust it because I've got the gray hair. I earned the trust of myself, partly through making some mistakes.
What's one piece of advice you would give to your younger self?
To trust the long arc of the story and not get discouraged when something goes wrong. Richard Branson says that opportunities are like buses. There's always another one right around the corner. And when things did go wrong for me, that I would give my earlier self, I'd say, look, dude, just hang out there. There's going to be another opportunity right around the corner, because that's proven itself true. Don't freak out in the fallow periods where it seems like there's no bus. Hang out. The bus is coming. There will be another opportunity right around the corner.
And I think that's very true. There's always opportunity, and there's always the next deal and the next everything. There's a million of them, and they are all there. So not wallowing in the minute, which is difficult to do, is a great piece of advice. If people would like to connect and find you and learn more about your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
There's a lot of ways that they can do so. So I'll just try to keep it short. But one is just go to Google or whatever browser you use and put in my name, Bill Treasurer. Other than that, go to couragebuilding.com, billtreasurer.com, or giantleapconsulting.com.
And I will put them all in the show notes to make it easy for people to find you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Rocky, truly, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Wow, what a powerful episode. We all have fears. Facing them and overcoming them is the key. Who wants to live a life of regrets? I know it's not easy, but having help and finding the resources to help you through the fear is key. Creating that strategic plan for your life and business are major steps forward because they offer you clarity, and then you can see if your work and life are in harmony. What are your values, and are they in alignment? Today's action step. Write down what a satisfying day at work 6 months from now would be, and then decide what 3 actions can you take this week to move forward towards that. I know I've been working through overcoming my fears and constantly taking little steps to move forward. As Bill said, you practice at your level and then you increase it ever so slightly. We don't need to take massive steps. You need to take little ones. That's a constant theme. Little steps compound in all areas of life to become massive success. I encourage you to check out Bill's websites. There are links in the show notes. If you're still listening, you must have liked the episode. So please share it with a few friends. It can start a great conversation. Remember, you can connect with me on Facebook. There's a Facebook page and a Facebook group for Richer Soul, where you can even help craft the questions for upcoming guests. What's preventing you from moving forward, and who are you putting on your team to help build the life you deserve? Taking no action creates a far worse outcome in life than trying something and failing. Can I help you achieve your goals through coaching and accountability? Just email me. We can start with a short chat to see if we're a good fit for coaching. For many people, one session allows them to take a giant leap forward towards their dreams. You can always reach me at rocky@richersoul.com. I'd love to hear how you're doing and how the information I have shared has helped. Thanks for listening. Have an abundant week.